Hi everyone, good afternoon. We'll just wait one more minute while everyone comes in, and then we'll kick off shortly. Thank you. Okay, we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Jess Liang. Thank you for joining another workshop in the series of workshops hosted by the Social Impact Hub as part of the RISE program, which is supported by Westpac Foundation and Paul Ramsey Foundation. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as extending this more broadly, acknowledging that we are collectively dialing from a range of locations today. So feel free to pop in the chat where you're dialing in from, so we get a sense of our audience. So we've had a privilege to work alongside some amazing, fantastic people and organizations in the for-purpose sector in developing this series of workshops. So really excited to bring you today Pia, who will be talking about managing external communications. Before we dive in, we just have some online housekeeping. It would be great if you can keep yourself on mute. If you have a question or a comment, please feel free to make use of the chat function. I'd love to make this as interactive as possible, and Pia would be more than happy to answer questions as we go. And in the light of interactivity, if you can, we'd love to see your lovely faces and turn on your camera where possible. If you have any technical challenges, feel free to private message me and I'll do my best to help you out. That's everything from me. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Pia. Over to you.
Thanks, Jess, and hi everyone. Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us. It was really great to see the response, and I've heard from the Social Impact Hub how successful these workshops have been. I've watched a few of them, and there's just some great information out there. So if you haven't checked them out, I definitely recommend it. And really looking forward to learning more about you guys as well, and what you're hoping to get out of this. So please jump in at any time with questions if something kicks off in your brain and you've got a burning desire to get an answer right there and then, because others will probably be thinking the same thing. So I'd find that really useful to sort of answer questions as we go along, and we'll also have some time at the end. I probably won't go to the full 90 minutes. So I want to get you guys doing a bit of practical sort of stuff as well, get your sort of media minds on, and we'll go from there. Yeah. Look, so thank you for coming and welcome. I'm going to be talking about managing external communications. So I'll tell you a little bit about me and where I'm coming from, first of all. I'm a former journalist. I worked for The Australian for nearly 15 years and worked in Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, covering a wide range of rounds and stories, including politics, legal affairs, general news, sort of human interest, court stories, features, all kinds of things. So storytelling is basically my bread and butter, and I sort of made a bit of a life change to move out of journalism about 3 years ago. And like many have before me, it's a tough game these days. And I moved into basically PR and communications. So I now work for the Shape Agency, which is a lovely little agency, although we're growing a bit, based in Sydney and Melbourne largely. And our ethos is basically to help organisations which have a social interest objective achieve their communications goals. So that covers everything from communications and brand strategies to media relations to website design, crisis communications, and any sort of communication and also design needs. So some of the clients that we've worked with, I work with the Paul Ramsay Foundation quite a bit, who are one of the sponsors of this event with the Westpac Foundation. So we're involved with them doing various sort of media relations as well as sort of other external communications, things that they've got going on. We also do campaigns. You'll see here, Jailing is Failing. That's the Justice Reform Initiative's campaign, which is about trying to get Australia to reduce its over-reliance on prisons as the default response of the criminal justice system. We also do sort of media relations for various sort of bits and pieces, ranging from crisis communications to promotion of events, reports, things where organisations who might not have their own comms people, or they do, but they need a bit of extra support for sort of large scale things where they really want to make an impact. And we just help bring our experience and contacts there to help them achieve that. So I would love to hear a bit more about you guys. And I thought I'd just kick it off. I broadly know who was planning to coming along, although I know that's always sort of subject to change depending on how things are going on the day. But I'd like to just sort of open it up very briefly to sort of hear if there's anything particularly that you guys are hoping to get out of this session, if there's something that you'd really like to explore or ask how you could improve in your external communications, probably without getting too much into the nitty-gritty, but if there's just an area that you're really keen to dive a bit deeper into, or if you've had some good experiences or bad experiences recently or in the past that you'd like to raise, I'd love to hear about that too. So I'm just going to leave that hanging there for a minute, and Jess will let me know if someone's putting their hand up, hopefully. Don't be shy.
I'll go first. Hi, Pia. My name is Concita. I work at a Centre for Research Excellence as part of Sydney Uni, and I manage many of the external and internal communications, so including things like managing the website and communicating research findings to others externally, to end users, as well as to the, well, less so to the media. But I guess I'm interested in a more, I guess, structured, systematic way of developing a comms plan for a few years, not just for a once-off event. And any tips on improving websites as we're currently developing, redesigning our website as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that, Concita. I will talk a bit about comms plans, probably more focusing on the media side was going to be my plan for this. And yeah, well, let's come back to that, and hopefully I can come to some of those points. Anyone else? Yes, I see your hand up.
Hi, I'm Sophie. Thank you for having us. I trained many years ago in PR and back in the day before email. And anyway, so now I'm trying to work out how to create media lists and how journalists like to be contacted, because I know it's changed quite a bit. I hear that a lot of people like you can use LinkedIn to contact people. I just don't know what the kind of, and Twitter to contact people. I just don't know how to actually go about doing that. So I'd really be interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I would definitely come to that, and we're going to talk about how to sort of make a pitch and the technical sort of sides of how to find the person you want as well. So yeah, I'll put a big star next to that one. Thanks, Sophie.
Pia, we've got a couple comments in the chat, including how to make more of an impact with an impact statement. And secondly, how to clearly communicate your purpose so that this is captured succinctly across all external communications.
Yeah, and that purpose is obviously, it's the driving kind of force for everything that you guys do. So that's something that I will be talking about in terms of figuring out how you want to tell your story and where the purpose fits into the broader picture there, because it's fantastic. It's what makes you unique and so valuable. But there's a whole lot of aspects to your story as well, which I'll get into. Beautiful. Thanks for that. All right. Any more, or shall we keep moving on, Jess?
No, I think the last comment's just open to whatever you present. So over to you.
Let's get into it. Cool. Thanks for that. So communicating for social impact is exactly where I was coming to, because that's why we're here, why you guys do what you do. And we want to talk about how we can use external communications to really amplify the impact that you make. So why would we want to make external communications a priority? First of all, to tell your story, to tell what you guys are about, make yourself stand out, get people interested. The audience for who you might be trying to get interested would vary, sort of depending on where you're looking to go, whether that's consumers, whether it's to potential investors or government. So we'll have a little talk about audiences later on. Share information, obviously, could be any sorts of information about yourselves, something that you've got going on, a product or an event, lots of things that we want to talk about there. To raise your public profile and improve your public reputation. So that's perhaps thinking more broadly about just your specific audience and going out to the wider public. So if someone drops your name at a barbecue or a dinner party, you're like, oh yeah, I've heard of them. They do good stuff, don't they? Yeah, ring a bell. That sort of ring a bell kind of profile. To grow your business, important, obviously, because you want to establish yourselves and stabilize and reach some growth as well. So that's why we need to communicate our story effectively and make sure we're hitting the right audiences to grow. Attract investors. Some of that will be through specific sort of investor relations, and part of it as well through that general raising of your public profile. To amplify your impact, so you can increase sort of what you do by sort of growing the business and letting people know about what you're doing as well. And to protect your reputation in times of crisis. No one wants to think about a crisis hitting, but it eventually comes to most, unless you're extremely lucky. It could be something small scale, something that you just need to manage around staff or supplies, something like that. It could be something bigger in terms of reputational risk. And I'll come a bit more to that later, because that's something where communications really takes on a paramount kind of role. So that's an area where you would need to be sort of very mindful of the impact that your communications could have, and perhaps think about bringing in some external advice as well. All right, so I've just got one little example I wanted to share with you guys, which is a bit of media work I did recently for one of the partners at the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And I'll show you the video, and then I'll sort of talk to you about how I got this media coverage and what it sort of what the goals were and how we sort of achieved all that. But it's a nice little video, and I thought I'd just like to share it with you. Hope this works.
A Brisbane-based charity uniting rescue animals with veterans and NDIS patients is planning a nationwide expansion. Its workshops help people experience social isolation, which is on the rise in the pandemic. Lily Greer has the story.
This is Rescue Kelpie Dorothy. She's partially blind, requiring extra care and attention, which Tom, Connor and Brandon are more than happy to give.
She can sense stuff, like from her ears, her nose, her paws.
They're a part of a Happy Paws, Happy Hearts workshop, the charity uniting rescue animals with NDIS participants, veterans and other support services in a bid to beat social isolation.
Well, I feel happy.
Loving and excited.
Interacting with dogs, guinea pigs and mice, learning new skills.
When I got to know a lot of animals, I get really good around people my age.
We really focus on trying to pathway people into volunteering, education or employment after pulling them out of social isolation.
Running classes at Wacol's RSPCA Centre, Happy Paws is on track for a huge expansion, receiving a $1.4 million loan from the Paul Ramsay Foundation.
Right now we're working with 345 participants a week. With this funding, we plan to increase to 36 locations across the country and hope to reach thousands of participants.
For people and creatures, classes like this are a win-win. Participants come away with increased confidence and social skills, and the animals get some much-needed love, making them more adoptable in the process.
Already our participants have contributed over 16,000 hours of really good quality training, socialisation.
Lily Greer, 9 News.
A Brisbane-based charity.
Don't you say that again? Thank you. So I'm not going to lie that when the Ramsay Foundation first told me that they were going to be giving this impact investment to Happy Paws, Happy Hearts, I went, yay! Because my journo head just goes on. I went, animals, cute animals, like that is gold for photos, for video. Everyone loves a happy animal story, and stories about animals, you know, helping people. It's just a sort of feel good kind of story. So I will be brutally honest and say this was one of the easier stories I've had to pitch lately, and it doesn't happen that often that you get something like animals or kids or that whole kind of really feel good thing in a brightly packaged up little parcel with a bow on top like that. But we did have a bit of work to do here in terms of getting it across the line. But yeah, it was a nice one to share. So I'm going to talk about how we got this and sort of walk you through some of the steps. But first of all, look at why this was an effective instance of external comms that I thought would be worth sharing with you guys. First of all, it raised awareness of the brand, Happy Paws, and let people know about them, particularly, you know, people who might not have ever heard of them, because it's a fairly small kind of thing at the moment, but obviously going to get bigger and go into other states. And this story carried across into other states as well, which was fantastic for them to sort of, you know, grow that reputation so people know that they're coming ahead of this expansion. It celebrated the partnership and their stakeholders, which was the Paul Ramsay Foundation in this case, and the RSPCA. So obviously, you know, it was great from the Ramsay Foundation side to sort of celebrate one of its partners and the partnership, but also for Happy Paws to be able to say, look, thank you, and we're really excited about this, and also to the RSPCA, who are of course one of the main stakeholders as well. And one of the other things that the Happy Paws boss said to me was that she was really pleased because she hoped that by watching the TV news at home, people who might benefit from the program would find out about it, that they might be able to reach some other people who could benefit from the program. So that was one of the main highlights for me as well. So how did we get there? Basically, I did a media release after sort of finding out more about Happy Paws and thinking about what we might be able to do in terms of a photo and filming opportunity. I'm going to talk a bit more about this later, but basically say that visuals are incredibly important when trying to get media. And something to think about probably in all aspects of your external comms. Almost everything looks better with a photo or a really smart design element. And if you are going out, especially for mainstream media, being able to have a good supplied photo that you bring yourselves, or a photo opportunity or filming opportunity can be just incredibly valuable in terms of getting across the line. I'm going to say that supplied photos particularly are especially important these days. There have been massive redundancies in newsrooms around the country, and photographers are often the first to go. So if you go out to a journalist and say, I've got a story, that'd be great. Can you send me a photo? Because we don't have a photographer who can come out and do that. And a photo just helps you land on the page or on their website so much more than just a bit of text, which doesn't grab the eye in the way that a photo does. So that was the first stop, to sort of figure out what we could do in terms of providing those visuals and people that they could talk to. The human elements, getting people who can speak sort of from their own experience about the program or the business. It's incredibly important because, yes, it's nice to hear from the people in charge who are running the show, but nothing demonstrates impact more than hearing it from someone who's got the life experience. So that is something that I would underline for any time that you're trying to get out to media. So that all went into the media release, and then I picked my targets in terms of television. We went to a couple of the stations, and Channel 9 delivered a great story there, and the Courier Mail as well, with the little story up top, and they came out and did their own photo for that one. So I just wanted to sort of sidetrack to a point that some of you might be thinking, like, media, like newspapers and TV, that's so, 20th century, isn't it all digital? Shouldn't I just be focusing on the social channels or the influencers and the bloggers, that kind of thing? And forgive me for sounding a bit like a dinosaur here, but I am a bit of a dinosaur, even though I maybe look a bit young. But there is a huge case to say that it is still worth making that investment in time and resources to go after traditional media, whether that's mainstream, local, or your industry press, TV, radio, but print in particular. And I'm going to sort of talk you through why I think that way. So there's been a lot written in the past couple of decades, probably, ever since the internet was created, about the death of newspapers in particular. And yes, the numbers are there to show that newspaper hard copy sales, the sort of thing that you get on your front doorstep or wrap the fish and chips in the old days, sales are down. There's no doubt about that. And it's had a huge impact, particularly with the loss of a lot of advertising as ads move online, and it's a lot cheaper for ad companies, and newspapers don't get the rivers of gold that used to be referred to. But it's not worth writing them off, because even though the newspaper sort of responded by bringing in paywalls about a decade ago, it's been surprisingly well responded to in terms of people who are willing to pay for news. So they are still getting readers, especially as they spread across digital channels. So the websites, the daily email updates, also the Facebook pages, although things there may possibly change with defamation laws in Australia at the moment. But there's another big reason why I would say that print media still matters. A couple of reasons, actually. It's the thing that carries the media cycle. So the story that you read, the first thing, either online or in your daily newspaper, is picked up by the morning radio shows, radio all through the day, as well as the TV stations. So it still drives the agenda. And the other thing I would say is that it's read by the decision makers. So that might be government, that might be policymakers, that might be investors and big business. So if you want to hit the eyeballs that could make a difference to your business or your organization, getting a solid run in print and then amplifying that yourself as much as you can through your own channels is a great way to do it. So I'd like to sort of, with all that in mind, go to audiences a bit. because that all sort of affect how you're going to, which channels you're going to try and drive into, whether it's media or other forms of external communications. So this will sort of vary depending on your organisation and what you're trying to achieve. And for those of you who have already nutted out a communication strategy, this will be rather familiar because it's sort of picking up on those threads. Some of you, it'll be consumers if you're going direct to consumers. Others, it'll be investors, particularly if you're trying a growth period. For some, it'll be government, if there are things that you're trying to change in terms of policy or to get government investment as well. Sometimes it's peers or your competitors, sort of others in the field, and it is a really interesting dynamic, especially when so often is the case that NGOs are competing for funding against organisations who are maybe also trying to do the same thing or slightly differently, but you're all in this great space trying to achieve impact and purpose, but often competing against funding. So that's tricky as well, I see. And the general public, and that sort of goes, it might not be one of your main audiences or who you're thinking of, but they're out there, and that sort of goes to your general reputation and raising your profile. It's probably not the main audience you would be trying to reach. You'd be usually more targeted than that, I think, but it doesn't hurt for people to know who you are and what you're all about. So these are some of the types of external communications, and the one I'm really going to zero in on is media and media releases, and we're going to really walk through that in some detail. But I just want to go through briefly some of the other forms of external comms and a little bit about them. Newsletters and EDMs, so that'll be mainly to reach usually your investors, your clients or customers, as well as other interested parties. So that could be sort of others in the field who are just trying to stay abreast of what you're up to. And as an external comm, that's a really kind of direct communication. You've got all the influence over what goes in that. You don't have to worry about the angle coming in from someone else. You get to talk in your own voice. So that's, of course, incredibly powerful, but also maybe has a bit of a limited range in terms of only going to a small group of people who you know are already interested in your product or your organization. Social media, and I would highly recommend a workshop I saw earlier in this series on social media in particular. If you haven't checked that out, that really went into some detail about all the different forms of social media and what to look for and what to be aware of, because I think there is a lot to be wary of. And the only other thing I would add on that, and I'd direct you to that workshop, of course, but I would just say, be careful, because it is there have been sort of too many stories of people and businesses with social media slip-ups from time to time, which sort of land them in the news for the wrong reasons. So I would just say that always remember that it is going out to a public audience, even if it might just seem that you're talking to your friends or your customers and people who like you. It is accessible by everyone, and things can quickly sort of move out of control if they're not handled correctly. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. And I think most people are pretty mindful of it anyway these days, and with our Facebook profiles and all that sort of thing, and Twitter being a generally nasty sort of place these days as well. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. Website and marketing collateral. I'm not going to go too much into those, of course, but they all fit together, all of these. And if you're doing a comm strategy, it's something to keep in mind. But I know there have been other workshops on branding, I think, as well, which might be useful there. I'm just seeing should we check the chat? Oh yeah, how to deal with trolls. Hi Tiff, thank you for your question. How are you going?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Good. How to deal with trolls is a good question. And look, I wouldn't be an expert on this because I've, you know, had some personal experience and some professional experience. But I think, yeah, it is a very difficult subject, and you can sort of either go probably 2 or 3 ways in terms of whether you approach it and deal with it head on, or if you kind of try and shuffle it under the carpet. I know in your area it is a real issue. And I think it can largely depend on sort of a case-by-case basis, depending on what's being said and how offensive it is. But just thinking of one recent example I had to deal with, we sort of decided that it was, you know, it was like a small scale offensive kind of criticism, which can easily be sort of hidden and pushed to the side. But I know that can be a risk in terms of if they keep coming back and that kind of thing. But also dealing with it head on can be effective, but I would say they're also high risk. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and I think it really needs to be weighed up on a case-by-case basis, because there are a lot of sort of pros and cons from either going, you know, we're not going to take that, that's an offensive comment, we're calling that out, or taking a much more kind of subtle approach. Oh, and thanks for sharing that link, Jess, as well. So I'm going to get more into media releases and media, but one thing I wanted to ask you guys first is to have a little think about what's your story and how you could really summarize it nice and tight in 3 sentences if you met a stranger at the pub or a barbecue, or a journalist, you know, if that person happened to be a journalist, how you're going to say, oh, I come from this organization or this social enterprise, and we're fantastic because this is what we're trying to do, and this is how we have an impact. So the things to sort of think about there, and that's sort of what you have to do when you make a pitch as well, because chances are they might not have heard of you or be familiar with your work. So and people don't have a lot of time to read an email or talk on the phone. So you really need to get it nice and tight, 3 sentences at the most before you lose them. And things to remember there about what the audience might be: someone who's never heard of you before, or someone with a more nuanced kind of understanding of the field you're working in, like a potential investor or government body. And what's your organization's voice? So that sort of goes to your communications or brand strategy. And it'll vary sort of depending on what you do. It might be, if you're like a sort of a young, funky kind of social enterprise, something like, you know, the Who Gives a Crap or whatever, it's cool. It's a bit funny, a bit borderline offensive in terms of, you know, being a bit rude, but fun as well. If you're something a bit more conservative, then it's a different tone of voice, basically. So that's just something to think about in terms of the way you communicate your story across all channels. So not just when you're going into media, but for your Edms and even your social media. I know people have a tendency on social media to really sort of be a bit more relaxed, and sometimes that works. But it's worth keeping in mind that won't be necessarily perhaps the right fit for what you're trying to do as an organization. And thinking about your story and your message as well, one of the things that I think will be particularly pertinent for you as purpose-driven organizations is trying to say how you're unique, because it's great to have a purpose, but there are a lot of organizations these days who try to say that we're about purpose, we're about doing good. So it's about how are you unique, perhaps? How are you doing something that others aren't? Are you doing it differently, or are you making a different kind of impact? And why would people want to look or listen or buy from you as opposed to someone else who claims to be making a same sort of impact or is driven by the same sorts of values? one way to really stand out, I always think in a crowd, is to tell that human side of the story, to show your impact through the human experience. And that might be, it doesn't have to be sort of someone who you're sort of selling for, in terms of someone who's benefiting overall from the organisation. It could be a staff member. It could be yourselves even. And I think there was a question earlier about sort of how personal should we get in terms of telling our story, that kind of thing. So that's something we might come to as well. But yeah, just want you to try and think about what's your story and what's the human side of our story that makes us different. So I think I mentioned some of this before, but just to go into a little more detail back on newsletters and EDMs. As I said, that's to a very direct kind of audience, people who are already knowledgeable or interested in you and your organisation. They might be your stakeholders who you're trying to keep informed, and your communications there really need to reflect the voice and values of your organisation, and that should be fairly simple to achieve as well, as you're the ones writing it, and you really have complete control over this channel. And EDMs as well are really terrific for building a ladder of engagement. So gradually increasing the ask that you're putting out there to the people who you know are already interested in what you do, thanking them for their support, and then asking them to step up their engagement by asking them to share something, donate, volunteer, give a bit of their money or their time, and working them through to sort of lure them in a bit deeper to what you're trying to achieve and help you amplify your impact. Social media, and again, I'll refer you to that fantastic workshop, but just thinking a bit in terms of the channels that you guys might use and what the different audiences and purposes there are and how that might affect your style of communication. So Facebook, most of you probably use already for connecting with the general public and people who are interested in following what you're up to. Facebook advertising is incredible and probably something that you guys are already into. If you have a Twitter profile, that might be more for keeping in touch with what's happening at a kind of policy level that might affect your organisation, or talking to other sort of colleagues and counterparts in the field. I'm also going to say that it's a terrific way for following journalists. Journos are usually fairly Twitter obsessed. It was something that I really struggled with in the last couple of years of my career, knowing when to stop scrolling. And they're on there because it's just an amazing way to sort of find out about breaking news. The problem with it is that you can get sucked into this very blinkered kind of view of this is what everyone's saying on Twitter, so it must be true, and forgetting that it's actually a very small segment of the Australian population. I think it's about 3% who are on Twitter, compared with something like 50% on Facebook or even bigger than that. So, but that said, it is a great way to get a bit of intel on who's covering what in media, and finding out which journalists in particular might be interested in stories that you have to tell, and also how to contact them. So there was a question before about how to contact journos or find out sort of where they're at. And Twitter is a great way. I'd say almost seems like 80% of journalists in a newsroom will be on Twitter, and quite often they have their email address on there, sometimes a phone number, or they say their DMs are open. So that's a way that you can reach out directly to them as well.
Pia, we've got a question on what's the best social media platform or platforms to engage for policymakers? Yeah,
for policymakers, I would say, obviously, politicians are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, pretty much all of the above. Twitter probably seems to be where many of them are a little less restrained and open to engagement. You'll see them sort of TikToking, or not on TikTok, but chatting to journalists on Twitter quite a bit. So I would think that that's maybe one to check out, and just you certainly get a sense of more what they're interested in or what their views might be through Twitter, more likely than on any other platform. You know, Facebook would be run by someone in the electorate office, that kind of thing. But Twitter seems to be where they've still got the handle on it on the phone by themselves, which can be quite a dangerous thing, as we see from time to time. So if you're thinking politicians, I would say Twitter, but direct engagement there, I mean, it's possible, but could also be quite challenging, you know, if they're getting lots of direct messages and tweets at them a day, with many of them being probably quite offensive and abusive as well. So I wouldn't necessarily trust that your message would get through. So I'd go sort of the old-fashioned channels as well of, you know, writing to the office and ringing as well. But yeah, good question. Thank you. Instagram, many of you would be on Instagram, I imagine, and it's all about photos and making yourself look beautiful. So probably not one that you'll find the policymakers and journalists so much interest in, but can be highly effective for depending what you're trying to achieve as an organisation. And LinkedIn, which is just, you know, fantastic in terms of maintaining and building that professional reputation. Most of you would be sort of interacting with others in the same space, other similar organisations, but also your supporters and stakeholders on LinkedIn. And that's a fantastic place for sort of celebrating little milestones that you might have, the professional achievements or things that you've done, just to let people know that how you're traveling and hopefully really well, and build that network of support a little bit more. So now I was going to plan to take you through some of the real step-by-step sort of stuff with doing a media release and getting it out into some media coverage. And this is sort of some of the questions that I was going to address. Some of these sort of came in through the registration process, so thank you for that. When should you do a media release? What's sort of noteworthy for that? Who do you take it to? How do you write it? How do you pitch? And who should be the contact? And I know that obviously many of you are small and you might not have a dedicated PR comms. You're sort of the one with 6 different hats on trying to do everything. So I'll kind of talk you through that a bit as well. So when to consider a media release? You want to be a bit wary of doing a media release at the drop of a hat, just because it's worth hanging on to moments when you really have something to celebrate or something to say, I suppose. So you have to sort of think, what's happening? Is it new? And why should people care? You know, if I told this to someone at the street or down the cafe, would they say, oh, that's nice? Or, oh, wow, really? You know, tell me more. I'm interested. So that could be an announcement of something that's happening to you. It could be a sort of a new partnership, a new development in your business that's really lifting things up a notch. It could be a milestone that you've reached in terms of your impact, probably more than an anniversary, like, oh, we've been around we're having our 2nd birthday or something like that. It's like, no, we've achieved 10,000, what you can call it, or we've given our 4,000th donation to blah, blah, blah. So something that really shows that you're having an impact. It could be a breakthrough, something that you guys have been working towards for a long time that you're finally achieving, and it's worth celebrating. Something that demonstrates your impact, and something I hope you don't ever have to come to, but if there's a crisis and you need to sort of state your position and give people the real facts or the best version of the facts about what's going on, crisis communications usually calls for a media release as well. But I put stars around that because it's sort of a danger zone and an area where often you can be so sort of entrenched in the problem that it's worth calling for professional help and say, help, we're having a crisis. And just getting someone who can sort of see the wood for the trees, as it were. So going back to our audiences, they'll be influential in terms of defining which kind of media target you're looking to hit. Print media is if you want to hit basically all of the above, but particularly consumers. So we might be thinking of local media, and many of you would probably say you haven't seen a local newspaper land in your letterbox for a long time. That's because most of them have either closed, which is very sad, or gone online. They might even just be on Facebook, even without a dedicated website of their own. But they usually have survived somewhere, but it can be in a very reduced form. Worth looking out for, though, because I find local papers, if they exist, still love to celebrate local businesses. So that's a great sort of first port of call sometimes, particularly for the smaller stories. Industry press, for many of you, that might be something like pro bono or third sector, definitely worth reaching out for. The main metro newspapers, so Sydney and Melbourne, that's the 9 papers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, News Corps, the dailies in every capital city around Australia, and West Australian in the West. And the national papers, the Australian and the AFR, the big ones. I used to work for the Oz, and I'm going to say that, you know, people think of them as probably quite rightly, the older Australians newspaper, but they do have quite an interest in great human stories as well, particularly with photos, because a lot of the coverage is very heavy politics, business based. So they're always looking for fun or interesting kind of photos and stories to break that up. The AFR, even more of a business angle, and then the online papers as well, like the Guardian and the New Daily, which probably, because they don't have a hard copy paper to fill with photos and things, can be a bit more selective perhaps, but also more interested, I would say, in this space as well. So something to keep in mind. Radio and TV there as well. As I said, I think many of them, the producers still pick up interesting stories from what they see in the paper that morning. So it's often worth going to print first and seeing if you can land there, and then push that out a bit further through radio and TV. Talking about targets, my advice would be to try and find a specific journalist who might be interested in your story and try going directly to them, rather than sending a generic kind of media release or email to the newsroom or the paper as a whole. If you can narrow it down and show that maybe you've done a little bit of research, you see that a journalist has written stories about organisations like yours, or you think that they might be interested in the work you're doing because of something that they've written, then that's really valuable for a journalist. And make them think, oh, you know, this person, they know what I write about. You know, they haven't come to me because I'm covering a completely different field. You know, journalists get sometimes quite annoyed if someone contacts them about a story that they would have zero interest in. You know, like it's a business story and they're the education reporter, or it's a health story and they're the social affairs writer. You know, it's like, it's not my round. I don't have time for this. So I'd say that's worth doing a bit of research, and Twitter particularly can be quite handy there in terms of working out who covers what and seeing what they've been writing about lately. If that fails, if you can't get a good sense on who the best journo might be, then you can sort of go a bit more broadly, maybe pick one or two, or try to get to a chief of staff. You can just call the newsroom and say, you know, can I have an email for the chief of staff, or the best email address for them to try and get through. Reading the paper is also a great idea to try and figure out who might be specialising in your area. Sometimes it's not online, but you know, just and paywalls do make it a bit harder, but picking up a copy of the paper, you know, for a few days a week to try and figure out who's writing what can be very valuable. So some things to think about before you start to write your media release. I go back to what's new, what's happening, and why should people care? So that's really kind of going to be like the top 3 lines of your media release. So that's what you really need to nail into. What's your story? So that's going to be the story of your organization, but that might not necessarily be at the top, because in some ways that can be old news. So you need to find the hook, which is the new bit, and stick that right at the top to really grab the interest. Who's the spokesperson? That's probably going to be you, maybe, whoever's running the show. But there might be some other voices in the story as well. Person with lived experience, someone who's benefiting from the sort of work that your organization is doing. Having at least sort of 2 voices in there can be very valuable, because one of the things a journalist has to do when writing their story is get a couple of voices in there. Like it's boring and sort of reads like a press release if it's just one person talking about their product or their story. It's like, oh, well, didn't you talk to anyone else? You know, how do we know this isn't bullshit? So try and get a few voices in there. That'll make the job easier for the journalist, which is really part of the goal of press releases, to make it as close to a real story as you can, to minimize the amount of work that they have to do themselves. And as a journo, I would have to say that I was always like, oh, I'm not just going to write it off the press release. You know, I'll do my own research. I know people, I'll make my own calls on this. But it's a sad reality that a lot of the time journos just don't have the time, or they've, you know, got 4 stories to file that day, and just don't have the time to pick up the phone and call everyone that they usually would do. So the easier you can make it, the more likely it is that they'll just say, oh, you know what, that they gave me all the information I need. I'll just bang that out. So try to make it as easy as possible. And that can be in terms of the voices in the story, having really great quotes, quotes that grab attention, quotes that are catchy and make a bit of an impact, that aren't too technical. They're in terms that people can understand, so they don't have to sort of, you know, pick up the dictionary or call you and get a 10-minute explanation on what this means or that means. And also in terms of laying out the visuals, again, giving them a photo, or giving them a case study, things that they can easily slot into the story so that the work is all done and it's nice and easy. Because yeah, like I said, journos are just under incredible pressure and often turning around multiple stories in a day. And the easier you can make it for them, you got your foot in the door so much further than if it's just a sort of, you know, here's a bit about me, give me a call to find out more. So I would say put that really high. If you have case studies or a photo you can give them, or you're offering them to come down and see it for themselves or film, put that right up high or in big letters, you know, in your email, because they want to see, you know, especially with COVID, we've all been living through, you know, ridiculously tough times and are looking for happy news stories or interesting non-COVID stories. So I would say that it's really valuable if you can deliver something like that and make clear sort of what you are, who you are, and what you have to offer up high. And that sort of goes into the human touch as well, giving stories a human face, and that's so terrific for showing your impact. Whether it's people that your organisation has dealt with directly, or if it could even be you or your staff, but just something to make people remember you by talking about the people who are involved as well. Into the nitty-gritty. 10 rules for writing media releases. Some of these will probably sound pretty simple, but it's definitely worth laying it out. And I know that some of you might have already had some experience with media releases, but this could be fresh for some. So I'm just going to try and make it as simple as possible. Keep it short, not pages and pages. And I know it can be really tempting to talk about yourself and all the fantastic work that you've been doing for like at least 2 pages or more, 50. You could probably write a book. But as I said, time is short, and particularly when people are looking at things on email, you know, you'll read the first 3 lines and move on. So try to keep it to 1 page if possible, or the very top of 2 pages. And make sure you have the really nitty-gritty, important, newsy stuff right at the top, because otherwise they might not keep reading. Keep the sentences short, keep the sentences snappy. Again, it's about making sure that if they wanted to just copy and paste this into a news story, that it's really easy to do so, and that you don't have sentences that go on and on and on and on for too long and just take up too much space. Try to be as brief as possible. Don't bury the lead. So the lead is the first line that you read in the news story is like, you know, so-and-so has announced, or in a major breakthrough, X, Y, and Z. Don't stick that down in the 4th or 5th part. Make sure it shines right at the top, because they first want to know what's new, what's interesting, why should I care, before they decide to keep reading. A headline, don't forget a headline to grab attention. And the headline should be something that you'd be comfortable to read if they did run a story, something that they could just pick up and use. But at the same time, you don't want to make it too long. Headlines are short and a bit snappy by definition. So make sure that it grabs attention, but it's also something that's accurate. Write like a journalist, which might not be easy, but it can be fun if you want to try and give it a try. It doesn't have to be a kind of news of the world, daily telly style journalist. There's lots of different styles around, but basically trying to keep it snappy and brief, but accurate. Again, going to that point that they could just copy and paste it over if they wanted to. I know that depending on sort of the nature of your organisation and what you're about, it might not always seem immediately approachable. You might be dealing with some very complex subject matter. But even with that, if you can break it down as simple as possible, it just helps enormously in terms of getting and keeping eyeballs on what you've got to say. Write to the journo's audience. So this will vary depending on which media outlet you might be trying to target. It could be readers of the Financial Review, for example, who would know all about all sorts of financial, political goings on because they read the Fin Review every day, which is not the same as someone who reads the Daily Telly might know. People used to say to me, pretend you're writing for a 12-year-old. And that's probably where most major media organizations are still sort of aiming for that sort of, it could be a very, very smart kid or an adult who, you know, hasn't gone to university and so forth. So trying to keep things simple. But the audience will vary and your language can vary slightly with that, but generally simpler is always better. Make the quotes great, but back it up. So the quotes are like everything else. You have to be sure that they could be carried across to a news story straight away, that they're interesting and engaging, but don't claim things which you can't back up in real life. So if a journo called you and said, oh, you're saying that your organization is going to, you know, cure cancer and win the Nobel Peace Prize. And you're like, oh, yeah, well, we do have something in development that'll probably do that. So sure, because you don't want to see that plastered all over the front page if it's not going to happen. So yeah, but quotes, you can make a good quote. And I think most of you probably could, just working on the values and the purpose of your organization and talking about the impact that you're achieving, put that part in your own words because it's so great to hear about that from people in real life. That would be my recommendation. And as you're coming towards the end of it, ask the question, so what? And make sure that you've said, you know, what you're doing, but how does that fit into the bigger picture? You know, why is this important in the grand scheme of things? So why should I care? Something to just remember to take a step back. And if you didn't know anything about this, you'd be like, so what are you saying here? Why does this matter? Don't forget the 5 W's, which you might remember from school: who, what, where, when, why, and the media contact. So for many of you, as I said, that might be you. That might be the jack of all trades in your organization. And I think that's totally fine. You might have someone who deals a bit with comms or has a slight sort of PR background, and that's terrific too. As long as you're sort of comfortable putting yourself forward. If you're the spokesperson, you could be the media contact. If there's someone else in your organization who might have a bit more experience with dealing with media, terrific.
Pia, we've got a question. Do you have any thoughts on in media, in quotation mark, in email, in quotation mark, media releases, or media release as the attachment, or both?
Very good question. Definitely in email. And, you know, you may also want to stick it on as an attachment, make sure it's not too big, but definitely in email, particularly people might just be checking emails on their phone. Please see attachment. No, I don't have time for that. Move on to the next one. Yep, so I would definitely recommend it in email and as the attachment if you'd like, but in email is most important.
Great.
Thank you for that. So making the pitch. Have a target, ideally. Know who you're going to try and get. If you've done that little bit of research and digging around beforehand. I always think a phone call is great, but that can be pretty difficult, especially if you're trying to call one of the larger newspapers. Sometimes you just get through to the switch, you know, press 4 for this, press 2 for this, leave a message on this extension, and you'll never talk to a human being. So it can be really tricky. So if that's not achievable, and it sometimes still is achievable, you'll just see on the contact us page or on the bottom of, you know, letters to the editor page, there'll be a, you know, a editorial number or a newsroom number, or even, you know, got a tip, call us. And you're like, yeah, I have a tip. I have a great story about blah, blah, blah. So even if you just call that number, you'll get through to the editorial assistant usually, who's kind of the dog's body in the newsroom. You say, you know, I'd like to speak to such and such reporter. Oh, they're not there. Can I leave a message? If they can't put you through directly, and then follow that up with email. You can, from Twitter, you can usually find a reporter's email. Sometimes it's at the bottom of their stories, which is worth scanning for, or you might even be able to figure out sort of the format for the email. You know, it's joe.blogs@9.com.au, etc. If you just read a couple of the stories or have a look around on their website. Otherwise, just calling the newsroom and asking for a reporter's email address. They'll generally give you that. They won't give you a reporter's mobile phone number, but they'll give you the email address to contact them. Be polite and direct. Probably goes without saying, I imagine, but just say, look, I have a story I'd like to talk to so-and-so about, or I have a story I think you might be interested in. It's about X, Y, and Z, or this is new, or we're just about to announce, or we've had an amazing milestone. So as you would in your media release, basically give them the crunchy bit right at the top straight away, rather than saying, my name is Pia and you don't know me, but I work for a great organization and we're really doing some great things, and I've been around for so long and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, I've got a great story for you. It's this, and this is brand new and no one knows about it. And we can give you great photos or an amazing interview with blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh. So yeah, don't be afraid to sort of blurt that all out at the beginning if you do get someone on the phone. Otherwise, in the body of your email. So I would say put a little introduction at the top of your email with sort of who you are. I'm getting in touch because I have a fantastic story with this and that's brand new. We can give you the story exclusive with photos, blah, 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 blah. further information in the media release below. Please call me, blah, blah, blah. Don't be discouraged. It is tough out there, and you might not hear back from people straight away. Follow up and try again. People, particularly journalists, are very busy and can get 100 at least emails a day. So yours might not immediately stand out. Don't be afraid to try again 2 days later with another email or a call to the newsroom if you can try and catch them and say, I'm just following up. Not sure if you saw an email I sent you. I'd love to talk to you about this and go through the process again. So I just wondered if anyone wanted to have a little crack. We've probably got about 15 or 20 minutes left. If anyone wanted to use this time or otherwise have a go in your own time later on, maybe you've got something that you're thinking would be good for media and you'd like to have a little go of writing the start of a media release. I'm not going to be cruel and ask everyone to share, but if anyone would, I'm happy to leave a bit of time, or maybe we'll come back to that later, and if anyone feels like it, we can. But it's just something, it's good practice. Whether or not you do have something immediately newsy, which you think would be potentially interesting for media or other kind of push on external comms, but just good to sort of get in your own mind, you know, who are we and how do I explain it really short and snappy to someone who's never heard of us and saying, why should I care about you guys? Something I mentioned before, why you might want to call in an agency like ours or someone else with a bit more experience in media and comms and professionals. And crisis communications, I think I mentioned as one of those times when it would be very advisable to do that. That's when the stakes are high. You might have your reputation on the line, some potentially aggrieved stakeholders. And when you're in the trenches, in that situation and the adrenaline is pounding, it can be very difficult to sort of look beyond and find that sort of even keel and strategic point of view to take your best step forward. Agencies and people like me, we keep an eye on what's going on sort of at a policy level and in the sort of the context which you might be operating in. We have contacts, but you know, if you say, oh, such and such a journo is going to write a terrible story about me and I can't bear to think what's going to be on the front page, we might know them. They might have gone, you know, I might have given them a job one day or gone to the pub with them. So leveraging that contact and experience can be quite helpful. So I know that lots of you might not have the resources to think about agency support all the time, but there'd be some times when making that little bit of extra investment could be very worthwhile for the overall outcomes. And that is pretty much where I wanted to come to in conclusion. So I might just see if we want to open it up to questions. I'm trying to think if there were any from the start that I didn't go to, perhaps. So please feel free to sing out if you had a burning question, which I haven't gone to. I know we haven't gone a lot into communication strategies, which was one of the questions from Concita at the beginning. I think probably because that's a very, or maybe a bit more of a nuanced kind of area depending on each organisation. Whereas I thought a little bit of media help would be something which everyone would benefit from more broadly. So apologies about that, but yeah, let me know if there are any other questions I can help with. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and I hope that was useful.
Okay. Thank you, Pia. Just looking in the chat, everyone's just thanking you for a great, awesome session today. I think everyone's got a lot out of this session in terms of where they can start with media, external comms, and reaching out for support when they need it. If anyone doesn't, also we've just got question come through. Steph's asked, are there any financial costs associated with media releases?
So it sort of depends, I guess, what kind of, I'm not sure if you mean the distribution or the drafting and the media releases. I'll talk about both. So drafting media releases, if you wanted someone else to draft it for you, then yes, there is a cost for that. If you wanted to get a media release distributed, there are sort of channels which do that. And yes, there's usually a cost for that as well. If you go to an agency like ours, we'll include the distribution through our networks as part of the overall. So yes, but you can of course do it yourself. So write your own media release and put it out there yourself by finding those individual email addresses or phone numbers and contacting people individually, as well as through your social media channels and that kind of thing. But yeah, there can be costs depending on how wide scale a distribution or professional drafting process you're thinking about.
Yeah, and obviously you can also do it by yourself if you're got a lot of time but not enough resources, then that's something you can do yourself. We've got another question here. When is pitching to media too regular, as in too often?
Yeah, you don't want to be the person who pings them so often that as soon as it comes in, it gets straight to the trash, because it's like, oh, not these guys again. So that's a good question. I would say, the important thing is to make it sure that when you do send those pitches, that they're worth it, that they have something new and they can make an impact, that they stand up, basically. So not every little drop of a hat. I would be concerned about pitching something probably more than every 2 months. I think that would be the closest that I would probably, closest interval I would bring it to.
Yeah, so you would want to make sure it is definitely an announcement, like you mentioned, or something important that we're celebrating or demonstrating the impact of the work that you're doing.
Something that's worth a story. Yeah, some things that we often do, if you don't think that a journalist might particularly care, you might still do a media release, but it might be something that you share on a smaller scale, for example, just through your social media. And sometimes you can, ping certain journos on social media as well, just give them a little, so they see it, and that's not quite as annoying as pestering them with an email in person or that kind of thing. So sharing it through social channels can be better for those sort of very smaller scale kind of, not going to make the front page kind of stories. Yeah.
Great. I don't think we have any other questions. Thank you everyone for joining this workshop on this lovely Friday afternoon. I hope you all have a great weekend. We appreciate your feedback and improving our workshop series. So I've just popped in the link there. So would appreciate if you take 1 to 2 minutes of your time to see if this content was valuable to you and how we can improve in the future. You can also reach out to Pia at the web email that she's put on the slide there as well. And we will have another workshop in the series on the 19th of November, so in 2 weeks' time, on strategy frameworks for social enterprises. So stay tuned for that. If you're interested in strategic planning, how to maximize your impact, then that's the workshop to be at as well. But otherwise, have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Cheers, Jess.
Thank you.